Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for our third and final lesson of this unit about imperialism. So far, we've learned about why America became an imperial country at the end of the 1800s, and also about the Spanish American and Philippine American Wars. Today's lesson is a bit of a mix of things, so let's start by looking at our topics. We're going to begin by learning about American involvement in China, specifically learning what were spheres of influence, the open door policy, and the Boxer Rebellion. We'll learn about President Roosevelt's way of dealing with other countries, which we call big stick diplomacy. We'll also look at some of the other things Roosevelt did, including the construction of the Panama Canal, an idea called the Roosevelt Corollary, and how Roosevelt won the Nobel Prize. We'll finish by learning about two other presidents, Taft and Wilson, and their ideas of dollar diplomacy and moral diplomacy. Let's get started with a country that is still tremendously important to the United States, even today, more than 100 years later, for mostly the same reasons it was back then: China. By the end of the 1800s, Europeans had been thinking about how to get rich by trading with China for hundreds of years. After beating the Spanish and winning control of the Philippines with its ports where ships could refuel, American businesses were ready to make their dreams of trade with China a reality. In the beginning, Americans did very little business in China, but captains of American industry knew that there were millions of Asian customers ready to buy the things American factories were making. American businesses were not the only ones thinking about how to make money in China. Other countries, including Japan, Russia, Great Britain, France, and Germany, also hoped to open trade with China. Already in the 1840s, Great Britain had forced China to let Europeans do business in Chinese ports. Even though Great Britain had the strongest relationship with China, other Western countries also started to make their own relationships, mostly by sending Christian missionaries to China. In 1895, Japan defeated Chinese soldiers in battle and forced China to give up control of Korea. Germany and Russia both forced the Chinese government to let their businesses operate in China. One by one, each country made their own sphere of influence, where they could control business and make sure that they could make money from their own part of the Chinese market. Americans were worried about how fast other countries were dividing up China into these spheres of influence, and most of all, they didn't have their own sphere. Unlike Europeans, however, that each wanted their own area of China, their own sphere, the Americans wanted to be able to trade with people in all of China. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay announced the open door policy. This idea was that there would be no more spheres of influence. Instead, any country could do business anywhere in China, including the United States. On paper, the open door policy seemed like it was going to make everyone equal, but it actually was very good for the United States. Free trade in China would help American businesses because their factories were making better products than other countries and were more efficient and had lower costs. The United States could flood China with American products that would cost less and be better quality than anyone else could sell. In this way, the open door policy would help the Americans while pushing the Europeans and Japanese out. Leaders of the other country with spheres of influence in China mostly ignored John Hay when he announced the open door policy. They knew it would not be good for them. But Hay announced it anyway, and American businesses started selling American products in China, even though no one told them it was okay. At first, the Chinese government welcomed the Americans because the United States had promised not to let any of China be taken away and turned into a colony. If this had happened, then American businesses would have been cut out. So the open door policy also protected China's independence. A year later, America used force to make sure it would be allowed to do business in China. But it wasn't the Europeans or Japanese who were the enemy, but the Chinese, a group who called themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, started an uprising to get rid of all outsiders who were controlling business in China. Americans and Europeans called them the Boxers. And to stop the Boxer Rebellion, the United States, Great Britain, and Germany sent 2,000 soldiers to China. This reminded other nations that the Americans were willing to use force to uphold the open door policy. Later, the open door policy would lead to problems between the United States and Japan in the 1930s, when the Japanese tried to take control of Manchuria, the northern part of China. One of the most important presidents in all American history was Theodore Roosevelt. And we're going to take a little time now to think about how he dealt with other countries during his time in the White House. Roosevelt's foreign policy, or way of working with other countries, was based on his favorite African proverb: speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. The key to Roosevelt's plan was that he would use the Army and Navy as the big stick to threaten other countries. If other people were afraid of what the United States might do, they would choose to do what America wanted. To show how strong the United States had gotten after the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt sent the Navy on a round-the-world trip between 1907 and 1909. To show friendship, the ships were painted white, but the message of the Great White Fleet was clear. America was a powerful country, and Roosevelt could reach anyone, anywhere, with the big stick. The 16 battleships and many smaller ships made Roosevelt's point better than any speech ever could. Another thing that Roosevelt is famous for is the Panama Canal. In fact, the famous palindrome, a man, a plan, a canal, Panama, is about Roosevelt. Let's start by thinking about why the canal was so important. One of the things that had always made traveling and trade around the world hard was that North and South America are connected. The narrow bit of land connecting the two continents, the Isthmus of Central America, stopped ships from easily going between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The French tried to build a canal in 1881, but their plan failed, mostly because too many of their workers got sick and died from malaria and yellow fever. When he became president in 1901, Roosevelt was sure America could do what the French could not. He decided to build what the world now calls the Panama Canal. The best place to build a canal was across the 50-mile-wide Isthmus of Panama, which, at the time, belonged to Colombia. Roosevelt tried to get the Colombian government to give the United States permission to dig through their country. But the Colombians kept asking for more money and were taking too long to decide. Roosevelt got tired of waiting. Roosevelt decided to use the big stick. Roosevelt started saying that the people of Panama should start a revolution to be independent from Colombia. In November of 1903, he sent American battleships to the coast of Colombia. Business leaders in Panama who wanted to become rich, selling things to the Americans who would come to build a canal, knew what Roosevelt was telling them. Start a revolt, and the American Navy would be there to stop Colombia from fighting back. Colombians also knew what it meant. Roosevelt was going to get what he wanted, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. In less than a week, Roosevelt recognized the new country of Panama and made a deal with the new Panamanian leaders to dig a canal in their country. The United States never fired a shot, with a clear and successful use of the big stick. Work on the canal began in 1904. In the beginning, the United States worked to build houses, cafeterias, warehouses, machine shops, and all support systems that the French had not. Most of all, the lives of the workers were protected. Dr. Walter Reed had figured out that mosquitoes spread malaria and yellow fever, and he distributed mosquito nets to cover beds and got rid of puddles and other places where mosquitoes could breed. At the same time, American engineers started to plan the canal. They decided to build a lock system that would carry ships up and over the mountains, but digging the canal was still a huge effort. Excited by the canal project, Roosevelt became the first president to leave the country while in office when he went to visit Panama to see the work. He even took a turn at a steam shovel. The canal opened in 1914, and it has forever changed world trade and the way the Navy moves ships from ocean to ocean. Once the canal project was started, Roosevelt wanted to send a clear message to the rest of the world, and most of all to the leaders of European countries, that the colonization of the Western Hemisphere had ended, and they should not try to come back. At the same time, he wanted people in Latin America to know that if there were problems in that region, the United States would send the Army or Navy to keep the peace. In other words, the United States would be the police officer for the Western Hemisphere. This idea became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary was an add-on to the original Monroe Doctrine from the early 1800s, which warned European countries to stay out of the Americas. In this addition to the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt said that the United States would use its Army and Navy as an international police force to fix any chronic wrongdoing by any Latin American country. The Monroe Doctrine was about keeping the Europeans out, but the Roosevelt Corollary was the United States giving itself permission to get involved whenever it wanted. Roosevelt put the new corollary to work and sent American soldiers to Cuba, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Colombia. Later presidents would use the Roosevelt Corollary to justify American involvement in Haiti, Nicaragua, and other countries. Latin Americans disliked what they see as Americans thinking we know best. In the eyes of many of America's southern neighbors, being rich and strong does not give the United States the right to meddle. Latin America wasn't the only place in the world Roosevelt dealt with as president. Asia was another place that mattered a lot to American businessmen and American political leaders. Roosevelt decided that the best way to get what America wanted in Asia was to keep all the Asian countries in balance, with no one clearly the strongest. When war broke out between Russia and Japan in 1904, Roosevelt set to work making sure that no one would come out much stronger than the other. As Japan's navy won battle after battle against the Russians, Roosevelt started to worry that Japan might become the strongest country in Asia and, if it did, could take over in China and push American businesses out. Roosevelt figured it was better for America to have Russia and Japan as equals, balancing each other out. Roosevelt arranged for leaders from both countries to attend a secret peace conference. The deal they made ended the war. Russia agreed to give Japan control of Korea, some Russian army bases in northern China, and half or part of Sakhalin Island. For his part in helping end the war, Roosevelt was given the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to ever win the award. Now let's turn away from Roosevelt's story and consider the presidents who took over after him. When William Howard Taft became president in 1909, he decided not to use Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Instead, his way of working with other countries was to use money instead of threats. For this reason, it's called dollar diplomacy. But dollar diplomacy was like big stick diplomacy. In both, America got what it wanted. Some Central American countries still owed money to countries in Europe, and Taft was worried that the Europeans might send their armies to Central America to collect this money. So he had the United States pay off the debts with American dollars. Of course, this meant that the Central American countries now owed money to the United States. Out of Taft's dollar diplomacy grew the idea of a banana republic. This name describes a country where foreign businesses are so important that the leaders of foreign businesses have more power than the actual leaders of the country. In the early 1900s, the two best examples were the Central American countries of Honduras and Guatemala. In Honduras in 1910, an American businessman, Sam Zamora, helped to overthrow the government and replace the elected leaders with new people who would be friendly to American businessmen. Back home, the United States didn't stop this from happening because the new government Zamora had helped put in place was better for American businesses. Over time, these foreign companies began to run more and more things in Honduras. They mostly grew fruit, such as banana, and they built and owned the roads, railroads, ports, and telephones in Honduras. If the people or the government ever tried to take back power from the American businesses, they just threatened to fire workers or shut down the roads. In the end, the people of Honduras voted for their government leaders, but it was American businessmen who ran the country through the power of the dollar. A similar story played out in Guatemala. Guatemala grew and sold bananas, coffee, and sugarcane, but most people were very poor, and the American United Fruit Company owned most of the land. In the 1950s, leaders in Guatemala tried to take land from the United Fruit Company and give it to poor Guatemalans. The company leaders got the American presidents at the time to send the Central Intelligence Agency to overthrow the government and replace them with leaders who would be more friendly to American businesses. Once again, when American dollars were in trouble, the American army was not far behind. The United Fruit Company is still strong today, but now we call it Chiquita Banana. Another possible example of dollar diplomacy was American support for the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii. Even though it happened before Taft was president, it's another example when the American army helped American business leaders overthrow leaders in a smaller country to make sure they wouldn't lose money. When Woodrow Wilson took over as president in 1913, he said that the United States would be a better neighbor. Wilson, like most Americans, thought that the United States was better than other countries in the world, and that the American government was the best way to run a country. He wanted Americans to be able to do business all around the world. But instead of trying to force other countries to do what he wanted, he said that the United States should try to help people. For example, he liked the idea of independence for the people who lived in colonies. This was called moral diplomacy. Wilson picked William Jennings Bryan to work for him as the Secretary of State. Bryan was a famous anti-imperialist, and he tried to solve the problems around the world peacefully. With Wilson and Bryan in charge, the United States even agreed to pay $25 million to Colombia to apologize for what Roosevelt had done during the Panamanian Revolution. Wilson also said he would not use the Roosevelt Corollary, Theodore Roosevelt's plan to be the police officer in Latin America. However, Wilson found that keeping his promises was not that easy. In the end, Wilson sent the army into Latin American countries more than Taft or Roosevelt. In 1915, when the president of Haiti was murdered and a revolution got started, Wilson sent over 300 soldiers to make sure American banks would not lose money they had given to the Haitian government. 1 year later, in 1916, Wilson sent soldiers to the Dominican Republic to force their government to pay back money they had owed to American banks. And in 1917, Wilson sent soldiers to Cuba to protect American-owned sugar plantations. But the most famous examples of Wilson breaking his promise of moral diplomacy were during the Mexican Revolution. Wilson said that the fighting between different groups in Mexico had to stop, and leaders there needed to let voters peacefully vote for a new government. But in reality, he wanted one side to win, and even sent the Navy to Mexico to stop a German ship from delivering guns to the side he didn't like. In 1914, a fight broke out between American and Mexican soldiers, and 150 people died. When one of the Mexican revolutionaries, Pancho Villa, led 1,500 of his followers across the border into the United States and attacked and burned the American town of Columbus, New Mexico, Wilson sent General John Pershing and the army into Mexico to find Villa and bring him back to the United States for trial. With over 11,000 soldiers, Pershing marched 300 miles into Mexico, but never found Villa. He did, however, make millions of Mexicans angry that Wilson had broken his promise of moral diplomacy once again. That concludes our story of American imperialism. Before we go, let's review the big ideas from this lesson. To stop European countries from dividing up China and cutting American businesses out, American leaders declared an open-door policy. They said that Europeans had to let American companies do business anywhere they wanted. Americans were willing to use force to get what they wanted in China, as was the case in the Boxer Rebellion. During the early 1900s, 3 American presidents dealt with issues related to imperialism. The first was Theodore Roosevelt. His approach was nicknamed the Big Stick. He believed that he could use American military power, usually the Navy, to intimidate less powerful nations. Roosevelt also started the construction of the Panama Canal, announced that the United States would intervene in Latin America as a sort of police officer, and won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War. President Taft followed dollar diplomacy. He wanted to use American economic power to influence other nations. This led to the development of the so-called banana republics. And President Wilson believed in moral diplomacy. He wanted people to decide on their own government. However, he used the military often, especially in Mexico, and did not give independence to American colonies like the Philippines. Thank you very much. Make sure you use your review guides and the Quizlet set of flashcards so you can remember all of the fascinating and important stories you've learned in this unit. Next time, I'll be back to talk about the First World War. I'll see you then.